Familiar, Book 5, Petals.
You what?
Emmy gasped, grabbing Sonic's hands in her own, her eyes sparkling with tears. Sonic nodded, carefully pulling his hands out of hers and stepping back slightly, closer to where Tails stood by the kitchen counter. Sensing his discomfort, she took a wide step backwards, holding her hands behind her back and bouncing on the balls on her feet.
This is great!
She said.
Did the mirror show you anything else?
Sonic shared a disheartened look with Tails before turning back to Emmy with a shake of his head.
No, only one thing. I'm not sure if I can watch it again, either.
He looked down at the fragment still clasped between his fingers reverently. He brought it closer to his face to inspect his reflection, wary of its sharp edges. The mirror gleamed in the glow of the lights above as he waited with anticipation.
Nothing,
he said with a sigh, watching as his face fell in the grimy mirror. Emmy pursed her lips.
Well, if this one exists, surely more do.
Tails stepped forward.
We're certain of it. I was thinking they'd be in places where significant memories were made.
Emmy hummed a note.
I'm going to sleep on that. See you guys in the morning,
she said, a hand still over her chin, and though as she ascended the stairs, eyes narrowed. Tails cleared his throat.
Knuckles, you still with us?
Knuckles jumped, turning to them with a sheepish smile from where he had been washing dishes half-heartedly.
Sorry, kind of tongued out there. That's great.
He dried off his hands before turning to them, clearing his throat and shifting his feet. He asked,
So we think we will find more in places we used to visit or not?
He kept his gaze on Tails, avoiding Sonic's eyes.
Ideally, where there could hold significant memories or a lot of them.
Tails repeated. Knuckles frowned in thought, moving to lean back against the counter. Tails turned back to Sonic.
I had a couple ideas for some trips we could make that might have shards on them, but I'm not sure if they are limited to this land or not.
Sonic nodded. If the shards were scattered around different worlds, it would prove difficult to find his memories. Could anyone take them? If so, he had no hopes of finding all of his memories. Knuckles cleared his throat and they turned to him curiously.
I'm going to go for a walk,
he announced, shooting them a faint grin before drifting outside. Sonic tilted his head. That was weird. As much as he disliked the idea of sharing a space with an Echidna, Knuckles was different to the other Echidnas. His silence left Sonic fidgeting with nerves. Tails only laughed at his confusion.
He probably wants to go ping on it somewhere quiet. He can get distracted easily.
Sonic nodded, sparing a glance towards the door. If Tails deemed it fine, Sonic could push aside his unease. He barely knew Knuckles yet.
All right, so the other ideas.
Tails brightened, turning back to him and clapping his hands.
Plenty you and I don't like to fetch stuff from other worlds all the time, so I wanted to visit those places soon.
Sonic perked up at the idea of exploring new places. Even if he had been there before, it would technically be a new experience if he couldn't remember the places, right?
Not to mention,
Tails added, viewing Sonic's interest.
there are a bunch of other places we would explore on this land.
Like that field or the mountain?
Sonic suggested. Tails gasped.
Yeah, those too.
Sonic nodded.
Tomorrow, then.
Definitely. We'll see what Emmy and Knuckles come up with in the morning and you can decide.
Tails said. Sonic hummed. What else would he remember? Sonic grumbled to himself as sunlight filtered through his transparent curtains and into his eyes. Why had his past self chosen them? His sleep had been cut up once again, a sudden bump in the night nearly causing him to fall from his hammock in shock. He had waited for any more sounds of a potential intruder, but none came, thankfully. Rolling over provided no relief, the mirror shard reflecting brightly into his eyes and making him wince. He threw his legs over the side of the hammock with more grace than he had the day before. His nose twitched as the savory scent of omelettes filled the room. He perked up, fatigue left behind as he followed the wafting scent to the door. The sounds of pans clattering and muffled chatter slipped underneath his door, and despite himself, he smiled. It reminded him of his home back on Earth. He slipped out of his bedroom, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Tails and Knuckles were already up and about, Knuckles dancing through the kitchen as he prepared breakfast, Tails darting around him as he set the counter for them all to eat.
Oh, Sonic!
Tails called out as he caught Sonic's eye. Sonic waved, wincing when Knuckles crashed into Tails in the moment of distraction.
Tails.
Knuckles chastised him, following his gaze to see Sonic. His eyes widened slightly before he smiled.
Hey, Sonic.
He called out, quickly turning back to the stove and flipping over an omelette. Sonic drifted over to the kitchen counter as Tails resumed racing around Knuckles.
Need any help?
He offered, fidgeting as he sat, waiting as they dashed about to prepare breakfast. Felt inconsiderate. At home, he would always help out Maddie in the mornings. Tom never allowed anyone into his kitchen while he cooked. Tails shook his head, jumping back as Knuckles glided past him to the fridge.
Nope, we're good, best to stay out of the way.
He grinned, ducking when Knuckles moved past, lifting a bag of Parmesan over Tails' head. Sonic watched them with intrigue, admiring how they seamlessly danced around each other as breakfast was prepared. Within minutes, he had a plate overflowing with a still steaming omelette in front of him, Parmesan flowed between eggs bursting with spinach and tomatoes. Knuckles leaned closer to add a dash of salt, nodding to himself before moving on to the next plate.
Butter pancake.
He said, raising a hand to his lips and making an obnoxiously loud chef's kiss. Tails snorted and Knuckles shot him a grin.
Oh, where's Amy?
Tails asked, shooting a look around the house. As if summoned by her name, loud thumps announced Amy descending the steps.
I'm here.
She called out, fixing her headband to her head.
Sorry, stayed up too late. I have an idea.
Sonic brightened at that, nodding for her to continue as she sat down beside Tails.
I'll want to take him to the orchard.
Amy said, more to Tails and Knuckles than Sonic. Tails perked up at the idea.
That's a great idea.
Nope, just me.
Amy cut in, sticking her tongue out.
You had him all day yesterday. It'll give you guys plenty of time to clean up his wall.
She said brightly. Sonic shifted nervously at the thought of going anywhere without Tails. Amy wasn't bad, but he still couldn't trust her fully. However, she wasn't an Echida, so she remained his second choice of the three of them. He dreaded the day he would need to go along with Knuckles. Tails leaned forward to glance at the filthy kitchen, scrunching his nose up in disgust.
Fine. Come back as soon as you find anything.
Amy grinned, clapping her hands together once.
Of course.
Then Knuckles spoke up. What?
Oh, could you wish pick up summer blues and strawberries while you were there?
Amy nodded.
Sure. What do you plan on making?
It's a surprise.
Knuckles said with a smile. Amy pouted, but Knuckles only shook his head, turning back to his food. Sonic took that as his cue.
You guys have an orchard.
Amy blinked, her fork halfway to her mouth as she stared at him. She shook her head with a smile.
Yeah, we planted it not long after we finished the house. It has saved us so much time and money on grocery trips.
She rolled her eyes. Sonic frowned.
Grocery trips.
They all shared a look.
We have to get our fruit somewhere.
Tails explained.
We grow what we can of this land juice and have everything. I'll take you next time. There's a whole world dedicated to supermarkets and it's crazy.
Tails shook his head at the thought of the place. Sonic's eyes widened at the thought. If Earth stores had whole aisles dedicated to sweets, what would an entire world of supermarkets have? Tails chuckled at his reaction.
They have almost everything there, except certain things from Earth. Weirdly enough.
He mused, placing...
I'll finish getting ready. Don't take too long, Sonic. It's a couple hours away.
She fixed him with a pointed look before dashing up the steps. Sonic nodded, shooting Tails an apologetic look before turning back to his own breakfast. He dug a piece out with his fork, taking a bite.
Oh, that's good.
He thought, sending Knuckles a toothy grin once he had swallowed his food. Knuckles shot him a smile back, looking down at his own food with furrowed brows. Sonic tilted his head. Was this another Knuckles thing? He pushed aside the thought, focusing on inhaling the rest of his food. Something told him Emmy wouldn't take well to tardiness. Something that felt like experience. 15 minutes later, Sonic and Emmy were waving back to Tails and Knuckles as they left, plumbing a well-worn path further into the island. In their hands, they each held a woven basket lined with blankets on the inside.
The fruits will rise with you to swinging the baskets around.
Knuckles had explained to him when Sonic shot a perplexed look inside. Sonic had donned his red jacket for the walk, the morning crisp and cool. The grass alongside them glistened with morning dew, shining silver in the sun's light, and the ground was damp and soft under their shoes. Sonic cleared his throat as they walked, the silence leaving him fidgety.
So, what plans do you have at the orchard?
He asked. Emmy hummed, turning slightly to face him.
Well, have plenty of fruit, apples, strawberries.
She made a face, narrowing her eyes in thought.
Some pears and oranges. Too much to name. We also have a big garden which Knuckles is always raiding.
Sonic chuckled.
Speaking of, he seemed a little weird this morning.
He said, looking back to the path as he bit his lip. Tails had brushed off his concern, but something told him Emmy would take his words seriously. Emmy frowned.
I did sense something out this morning.
She admitted. Sonic blinked.
Sense.
He mouthed the word to himself, but Emmy didn't seem to notice, too lost in her own notes.
If he's still feeling weird later, I'll talk to him about it.
She reassured Sonic.
But I'm sure some fresh fruits to cook with will cheer him up if he is upset.
Sonic nodded slowly. Should he ask?
I wonder what he's going to make for us.
Emmy mused, placing a hand to her chin and thought. Sonic shook his head slightly, pushing away any confusion. The moment had passed. Perhaps she had chosen odd phrasing. It was possible, as he tended to overthink things. Still, he couldn't help but feel as though there was something more to it. Sonic smelled the orchard before he saw it. A cool breeze brushed past him, its sweet scent leaving him sighing. As they ascended over the crest of a hill, the orchard grew before him in all of its glory. It was more of a farm than an orchard. As they had called it, rows upon rows of plants lined the area alongside a small orchard blossoming with fruits and flowers alike stretching back several hundred meters. Sonic sneezed as another gust of air ruffled his fur, and Emmy snickered. He shot her a glare before they carefully descended the steep hill.
Would you mind grabbing the apples while I grab the strawberries?
Emmy asked as they stood before the orchard. Sonic nodded, staring in awe at the sheer number of bushes bursting with vegetables before him. Tomatoes red as rubies shone from their vines, broccoli burst upwards from its shoots, and dozens of greens Sonic could name pak choi. Maddie might have mentioned once grew in batches, all glistening even in the lack of rain.
How did you get them so?
He trailed off, gesturing to the field before him. Emmy chuckled, moving her hands behind her back as she blushed slightly.
I guess you could say I have a way with plants. I can feel if they need something.
She shrugged, smiling brightly at him.
I'll be over in the strawberry bushes if you need me. The apples are a few rows back, but they'll be in season. You can't miss them.
She gestured over to the orchard before shooting him a wave and drifting over to lush green bushes freckled with red strawberries. Sonic shook off the odd wording once more, moving over to the trees towering over him. Even on Earth, he had never seen fruit trees this tall. Emmy had been kidding when she said she had a way with plants. He hummed and thought as he ducked underneath the twisting branches of a tree bare of fruit or flowers. He could ask whether or not the cheeky fox would answer him. He wasn't sure. Sonic almost walked straight into another branch, too lost in thought to notice. He swerved to avoid it, brushing it lightly with his arm instead and wincing. He huffed, narrowing his eyes at the tree, his nose beginning to tickle at the sight of the flowers blooming upon it. The areas free of flowers were laden down with pears, each one a shining grass green. He couldn't help but pluck a couple from the tree and placing them gently in his basket, ducking his head as he sneezed. Sonic moved on, sighing in relief as the pollen in the air faded slightly as the apple trees drew nearer. Emmy had lied when she said he couldn't miss them, the trees growing tall and wide. Apples spotted the branches like dazzling gems, and Sonic couldn't help but smile as he stopped in front of them. How many would Knuckles want? He scrunched his face up in thought. If Knuckles was planning on cooking them something with the apples, it was probably best Sonic grabbed plenty. Nodding to himself, he began plucking off the shiniest apples. Not that there was much competition to begin with. He gently placed them alongside the pears to ensure none of them would bruise, wrapping them up in the blankets as a last resort. If he began to absent-mindedly swing the basket as they walked back, he wanted to ensure the fruits had decent protection from his fidgets.
Sonic!
Sonic jumped at Emmy's call, smacking his head on the branch he had been ducking under as he closed up his basket.
Oh?
He whined to himself, rubbing his head as he stood up. He glanced around, circling when he noticed Emmy racing towards him, leaping over bushes in her excitement. She raised something above her head, waving it around. He narrowed his eyes at the item, flinching when sunlight reflected off of it and into his eyes. The giddiness filling him easily overwhelmed his discomfort, and he stepped forward to meet her as she slowed.
Is this one of those shards?
She asked, eyes bright with energy as she shoved it into his hands, wary of its sharp edges. Sonic glanced quickly at the grimy surface, that tugging sensation in his chest almost enough to send him stumbling forward. He turned back to Emmy before he was dragged away into another memory, the haze at the edges of his vision vanishing. He nodded.
It's definitely one. Where did you find it?
Emmy grinned, brandishing her basket.
Between the strawberry bushes. I almost pricked myself on it, actually.
She frowned, before shaking her head.
This is great! You have to let me know what you see.
Sonic couldn't help but smile at her effervescence. Couldn't I?
Definitely. I'm just going to sit down this time. It was a little disorientating last time.
Emmy nodded understandingly, leading him over to the great trunk of an apple tree.
Sit here. I'll go back to collecting some more produce while you watch it. Call me when you're down.
She smiled at him before moving over to an orange tree a few rows down, inspecting its fruits with a hand on her chin. She shot him glances every few seconds, unable to hide her excitement. Sonic shook his head, sitting down against the tree. He shifted until the bark wasn't digging painfully into his back. Picking up the shard once more, he dug out a spare blanket and wiped away any grime from its surface, smiling when it gleamed back at him. Dropping the blanket back into his basket, he held the shard closer to his face, running a hand along its smooth surface and giving in to the tug as it returned with renewed vigor. He closed his eyes as the black haze descended upon the edges of his vision, floating upon nothing as he fell back in time. Bright light filled his vision and he winced. Sonic raised a hand to cover his eyes against the harsh sunlight, blinking away the white spots in his vision. As he grew accustomed to the light, Sonic lowered his arm, squinting as he glanced around. He sat in the same space he had been in the future, only the apple tree had shrunk. Now, it sat at his head, still a sapling, pulling himself up to his feet. He began searching for his past self. He scanned the rows of upturned earth, its outlander bursting with bushes. Sonic grinned as he noticed a spot of blue resting upon the hill, beginning to trek his way over as contentedness washed over him in lapping waves. His shoulders relaxed at the sensation and he let out a sigh. His past self sat back on the hill, deemed the entrance to the orchard. His eyes closed as he leaned back on his hands. Emmy sat beside him watching the... Following her gaze, Sonic noticed Tails and Knuckles still hard at work. Tails scolded as he dug through a basket in his hands, turning and snapping something at Knuckles, only for Knuckles to double over in laughter.
They're doing it again!
Emmy's voice piped up from beside him and he shivered, turning back to where his past self was now shooting Emmy a curious look, sitting up properly. Sonic drew near, dropping down by Emmy's other side if only to alleviate the odd sensation of hearing her from a distance.
Doing what?
He found himself asking. Emmy pointed towards their friends, and he turned to survey the fields with his past self. Laughter bubbled up in his chest as he caught sight of Tails with his arms crossed petulantly, exploding from both of their mouths in a bright euphony.
Again?
He asked, shaking his head with mock exasperation. He couldn't help but grin at the sight of the two. Knuckles dug another hole in the ground with his claws, turning back to Tails expectantly with a fist clenched behind his back. Tails grumbled to himself, kneeling to plant seeds from the baskets lining the fields. He covered the hole with dirt, a smile making its way onto his face as he nodded in approval, patting down the soil. Knuckles smirked from above him, raising his hand and dumping a fistful of dirt into Tails' fur. The effect was immediate. Tails whipped up with a scowl, yelling so loudly at Knuckles that whis of his voice trailed over to Sonic and Emmy. The two burst into laughter at their friend's antics, his past self wrapping arms around his middle in a vain attempt to contain his laughter. Knuckles turned to face them brightly, waving with his entire arm and a toothy grin. Tails used the distraction to his advantage, turning and smacking him across the face with his tails. He raised his head with a smirk when Knuckles rounded on him with a pout, raising his hands to avoid another smack from his tails. His past self doubled over, leaning heavily into Emmy's side as their raucous laughter filled the air. Emmy placed her arm around him to steady herself, and Sonic felt her warmth bounce over his back as he watched the two of them collect themselves. Emmy wiped stray tears away from her face, letting out a sigh once she could breathe again and sitting back upright. Her lips remained quirked up into a grin. Rather than lean back, his past self chose to lay down in Emmy's lap, turning to watch the two still on the fields with half-lidded eyes.
Rest, Sonic!
Emmy's gentle voice washed over him. Sonic couldn't help but blink sleepily as she began to run her hands through his fur absent-mindedly, turning to face the sky with closed eyes.
Fine.
He breathed out, the world fading to darkness as he closed his eyes. He switched back to the present jarringly, a sudden jolt throwing him from the gentle lull of Emmy's hands over his fur, cradling him close. Sonic flinched, eyes snapping open. He shivered at the loss of warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, drawing his jacket closer with a shudder. Shifting back, he sat up straight, grateful he had half a mind to lean back against the apple tree before drifting off into the memory. A smile tugged at his lips at the thought of the new memory, and he reverently ran his hands over the now lifeless mirror. He should tell Emmy. Sonic scrambled up to his feet, shaking his head and leaning back against the tree when a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. Emmy had moved over to several bushes bare of any fruit, tilting her head as she watched them. She nodded to herself, running her hands gently over the leaves before standing.
Emmy.
Sonic called out, unable to hold back his excitement as he raced over. She jumped, turning back to face him with wide eyes. He drew her into a tight embrace before she could say anything and she froze, arms stuck to her sides.
It worked, thank you.
he said, squeezing her tighter. He had another piece of his memory thanks to her quick thinking. Emmy shook herself of her stupor, wrapping her arms around him.
That's great!
She said brightly.
What did you see?
We were all here planting our crops. You and I were taking a break and laughing at Tails and Knuckles.
Sonic told her. He pulled back to grin at her with shining eyes, and Emmy returned his smile.
I remember that.
She said wistfully.
That's a great memory.
She added with a...
It was peaceful.
He agreed.
Thank you for bringing me here.
Emmy blushed slightly.
I just want you to regain your memories.
Well, we should let the others know it worked.
Sonic added, racing back to grab his basket and the mirror piece. He wrapped the shard up in a blanket, placing it on top of the fruits with a nod to himself. When he returned, Emmy had her own basket packed up and a hand over her eyes to protect them from the sun as she watched him. She patted him on the back as he joined her by her side, and he couldn't help but match her grin when he didn't pull away. He could trust her, if his memory was anything to go by.
Ready?
He nodded.
Let's go.